At 3:42 a.m., my doorbell camera pinged. I checked. She was outside, kissing someone. Then whispered, "Delete that." The sound woke me before I even registered what it was. My phone buzzed with the familiar notification, "Doorbell camera activity." I rubbed my eyes, half asleep, expecting maybe a cat or a drunk neighbor passing by. Instead, when the feed loaded, the sight yanked the drowsiness out of me. Mara, the woman I'd been sharing my bed with for almost 3 years, stood in front of my door. She wasn't alone. She was pressed against a man, kissing him like the world was ending. I froze. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the casual way she did it, right there on my porch, as if my home wasn't mine anymore. The angle of the camera caught her leaning into him, whispering something after the kiss. I tapped the volume slider up, and the words cut through the silence of my living room. "Delete that." She wasn't talking to him. She was talking to me, or at least to the lens she knew was staring right at her. My stomach dropped, but something else rose in its place. Rage should have taken over, maybe grief, maybe shock. But what came was colder than all of that. There was no confusion left. No questions. She had served me the truth on a silver platter. I didn't wait for explanations. I pulled on the nearest jacket, walked to the front door, and opened it. The night air was damp, and the sound of the lock clicking made them both turn. Ezra. The man's name would come later. Though in that moment he was just a stranger on my doorstep, straightened with the arrogance of someone who thought he'd won. Mara's face drained of color. She stammered my name, but I didn't care to hear it. I just stepped aside, let the silence hang, and made sure my phone was still recording everything. The tension was unbearable. The man grinned like it was a game. Mara scrambled, trying to bridge the gap with excuses that didn't matter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. That would have given her something to fight against. Instead, I let the weight of my silence do the work. After a few minutes of flustered gestures, she finally pulled herself together and asked to come inside. But I only stood there in the doorway, blocking her path. That night ended with her outside, pounding on the door until exhaustion set in. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The image of her begging on the porch after being caught in the act was enough. At 4:10 a.m., she finally left, trailing behind the man who had been so bold earlier but looked much smaller now. When the quiet settled, I sat down with my phone again. I replayed the footage from the camera, not because I needed more proof, but because I wanted to etch the details into my mind. Her posture, his hand on her waist, the whisper that had started everything. I saved it to multiple drives. Backups, screenshots, safe copies. She wanted me to delete it. Instead, it would become the foundation of everything I planned to build. Sleep was impossible after that. I walked through the house, my house, looking at everything she had left behind. The shoes by the door, the half-empty glass on the counter, the sweater draped over the chair. They suddenly felt like intrusions, like evidence of someone who had trespassed into my life under false pretenses. I started bagging things. Not neatly, not carefully, just a raw sweep of her belongings into trash bags. The act felt cleaner than crying. By dawn, her presence was contained in black plastic at the edge of the living room. When the sun came up, my plan was already forming. Confrontation alone wouldn't be enough. She would expect yelling, maybe a breakup, maybe forgiveness after crocodile tears. But what she had done couldn't be answered with something so ordinary. Betrayal like that needed weight. It needed consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. The first step was control. I froze the joint account she'd been so eager to use for emergencies. I canceled the credit card I'd added her to when we moved in together. Within an hour, she went from having access to my money to holding nothing but her own thin savings. I imagined her waking up, reaching for her phone to order breakfast or transfer cash, and finding herself locked out. The thought didn't comfort me, but it steadied me. By mid-morning, she showed up again. She didn't bother knocking this time, just shouted through the door, trying to explain, pretending last night had been some misunderstanding. I stayed quiet, letting her words bounce off the wood. Then she tried the softer angle, talking about our years together, about mistakes, about forgiveness. She didn't realize I wasn't looking for apologies. I was collecting material. Every word, every plea was recorded, another brick in the structure I was building. She finally left when I didn't answer. But she wasn't gone. I saw the messages flood in within minutes. Long paragraphs at first, then shorter bursts, switching from pleading to anger and back again. I muted the thread and kept the notifications hidden. Her words were fuel, but they didn't deserve my attention in real time. The day stretched on. I went to work, acted like nothing had happened, but my mind wasn't on the tasks in front of me. It was on her, on the man, on the insult of being made a fool in my own doorway. The image of them kissing under the lens replayed itself in my head like a film reel, each cycle hardening my resolve. I didn't just want her gone. I wanted her to feel the kind of helplessness she had tried to put on me. That night, I sat in my living room, the bags of her things lined up against the wall like a barricade. I poured a drink, scrolled through our shared photos, and deleted nothing. Evidence had a way of becoming valuable when least expected. I started thinking about Ezra, the man who smirked at me like he had won some prize. I didn't know him yet, but I would. If Mara was reckless enough to kiss him on my porch, then she was reckless enough to have left me a trail to follow. By the second night, I had her email logged into an old tablet she once used at my place. She never bothered wiping it. The inbox was a goldmine. Plans with Ezra, receipts for hotels she claimed were girls' weekends, even petty exchanges where she mocked me to him. Every word stoked the fire, but it also gave me a blueprint. She wasn't just cheating, she was careless. That was her weakness. I didn't confront her again. Not yet. She wanted a fight she could win with tears and drama. Instead, I starved her of reactions. I let her messages pile up, her voicemails fill with desperation. Meanwhile, I made small adjustments. Her streaming accounts logged out. Her name removed from the car insurance. The friends she introduced me to quietly received screenshots of her with Ezra, attached with a short note. Thought you should know. No explanation, no commentary, just the raw truth. By the end of the first week, Mara was unraveling. She showed up again, banging on the door, crying loud enough for the neighbors to peek through blinds. I opened the door only once, just enough to slide a single trash bag of her belongings out onto the porch. No words, no eye contact. She cursed me, cursed the neighbors for staring, cursed herself when the zipper snagged and her clothes spilled onto the concrete. I stood behind the glass, recording again. Every humiliation mattered. That night, I sat back in the quiet of my house, and for the first time in days, I smiled. Not because I felt better, but because I finally had clarity. She had whispered, "Delete that," as if the proof was the problem. What she didn't understand was that the footage wasn't just proof. It was leverage. It was a spark, and I wasn't going to delete it. I was going to build an entire revenge on top of it. The days after that porch scene became a game of endurance, though Mara never realized she wasn't the one setting the rules. She thought if she pushed hard enough, if she kept showing up, if she broke through my silence, she could still steer things back to her advantage. But she was already trapped. The doorbell footage lived in multiple drives, her emails sat wide open on my tablet, and her financial lifeline had been cut. Every move she made only deepened the hole she didn't know she was standing in. When she called me the following Sunday, her tone was soft. No more shouting, no more theatrics. She wanted to meet, to clear the air, to tell me the truth. I agreed. Not because I needed her version of it, but because I needed her to believe I was still reachable. I chose a cafe near downtown, public enough that she would restrain her emotions, and small enough that the walls would listen. She arrived looking like someone rehearsing contrition. Hair tied back, makeup lighter than usual, clothes deliberately modest. She thought I would read her appearance as honesty. She launched into her story quickly. How Ezra was a mistake, how it was nothing serious, how she felt lost, how I had been distant. I let her talk, sipping my coffee, nodding occasionally. My silence worked better than any argument. She filled the void with words, and every sentence tied her tighter to the lie she was spinning. When she finished, I told her I was willing to forgive, but forgiveness came with conditions. She leaned forward like a drowning person spotting a rope. I explained calmly that we would start fresh, but she would have to cut ties with Ezra entirely. No texts, no calls, no lingering contact. She agreed too quickly, desperate for relief. What she didn't know was that Ezra's messages were already pouring into her inbox, and I was watching every word. From that moment, I played the role of the reconciled boyfriend. I invited her back inside, but only in pieces. She slept on the couch, not the bed. She ate food I cooked, not food she ordered. Every rule I laid down, she accepted, grateful for scraps of normalcy. To her, this was proof she still had a chance. To me, it was leverage. By pulling her closer, I kept her where I could see her, and where I could control the pace of her collapse. Ezra became the next target. He wasn't hard to find. A few quick searches through Mara's inbox gave me his full name, his workplace, even the debts he had been juggling through shady loans. He was cocky when I saw him that night on the porch, but behind that smirk was a man one missed payment away from panic. I started small. Anonymous calls to his creditors, subtle questions dropped into the right places, hints that he was unreliable. Within a week, one of his clients dropped him. His messages to Mara grew sharper, more desperate, blaming her for distractions. I showed her those messages one night, casually, as if they had somehow slipped onto my screen by accident. She tried to hide the panic, but I could see it crack her mask. She reassured me she had no contact with him, yet the proof said otherwise. I didn't call her out. I simply told her forgiveness required honesty, and she promised again to cut ties. That promise would become another chain around her neck. The beauty of it was in the performance. To Mara, I was the patient man giving her a second chance. To Ezra, I was invisible, but my presence crept into his life through rumors, sudden financial pressure, and the growing paranoia that someone was working against him. I didn't need to confront him directly yet. Watching him spiral through indirect blows was better. He started drinking heavier, missing deadlines, snapping at Mara through late-night texts. Each outburst made her cling harder to me, convinced I was the safer option. It wasn't just the two of them, either. Her best friend, Elise, reached out to me after hearing whispers. She asked if what people were saying was true, that Mara had been sneaking around. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I forwarded a single still image from the 3:42 a.m. footage. Elise didn't reply right away, but a day later, she called to say she wasn't going to cover for Mara anymore. Another thread of her support unraveled. The irony was that Mara kept trying to act normal. She talked about future plans, about trips we could still take, about family gatherings. I let her talk, smiling occasionally, as if I were warming to the idea. All the while, I was cutting her roots one by one. By the second week, her family had received anonymous packages, screenshots of her and Ezra's emails, copies of her expense receipts tied to hotel bookings. No commentary, no explanations, just raw evidence. Families don't forget that kind of betrayal. Her father, a man proud of appearances, stopped answering her calls. Her mother sent her one clipped message about shame. At home, Mara grew more restless. She tried harder to please, cooking meals, cleaning, laughing at jokes that weren't funny. I watched her perform, knowing it came from fear, not love. The more she tried to win me back, the more hollow it felt. That hollowness was my victory. She didn't realize it yet, but she was performing on a stage I had built. Ezra, meanwhile, became a wreck. His girlfriend abroad, Lydia, finally reached out after seeing strange charges on their shared accounts. She messaged me, not knowing who I was, but asking if I knew Mara. I didn't hesitate. I sent her the footage, the emails, the receipts. Lydia didn't respond at first, but 3 days later, she thanked me. She told me she was booking a flight back, and she planned to handle Ezra personally. I didn't stop her. In fact, I made sure Mara knew nothing about Lydia. The collision of those worlds would be better as a surprise. By now, the cracks in Mara's life were spreading faster than she could patch. At night, I would hear her in the bathroom, whispering on the phone, probably to Ezra, probably begging him to stay calm. I never confronted her. Instead, I would leave small reminders of what I knew. Her phone mysteriously unlocked, her emails marked as read, her favorite jewelry box empty until she searched for it frantically, and then found it back in place the next day. Not stolen, just moved. Enough to keep her unsettled. The tension escalated to the point where she began sleeping with the light on in the living room. She told me once that she felt like something was slipping through her fingers, that nothing felt stable anymore. I only nodded, letting her believe it was her imagination. The truth was simpler. She was living inside a cage I had built, and every day the bars pressed tighter. I started planning the public reveal. Quiet revenge was satisfying, but humiliation thrives in daylight. Mara had a cousin's engagement party coming up, a gathering she had been excited for weeks ago. Now she hesitated to attend, but I encouraged her, feigning warmth, telling her it might help her reconnect with family. She clung to that suggestion like a lifeline. She didn't realize it was a noose. In the meantime, I made sure Ezra's debts caught up with him. One of the creditors I tipped off threatened legal action. Ezra tried to shift blame onto Mara, calling her at all hours, demanding she help. I watched her crumble under the pressure, torn between keeping him calm and keeping me convinced of her loyalty. I didn't intervene. I let her suffocate between two fires. By the end of the second month, the roles were clear. Mara was a hollow shell of the person who once laughed freely in my kitchen. Ezra was unraveling, paranoid, and broke. And me? I was calm. Not healed, not righteous, but in control. For the first time since the camera pinged at 3:42 a.m., I felt like the world had tilted in my favor. The stage was set. The footage, the receipts, the texts, the family, the friends, they were all threads woven into a single rope. The engagement party would be the place to pull it tight. And when it snapped, it wouldn't just break Mara and Ezra apart. It would leave them both standing in the ruins of the lives they thought they could manipulate. The night of the engagement party arrived with an almost cruel sense of calm. The venue was dressed in white and gold, tables lined with flowers, music floating through the air. People came in their best clothes, laughter buzzing, drinks clinking. It should have been a night for joy. Instead, it became the perfect theater for everything I had prepared. Mara dressed carefully, more carefully than I had seen in weeks. She had chosen a fitted black dress, understated but elegant, as if simplicity could erase the chaos trailing behind her. She glanced at me often while we got ready, testing my face for cracks. I gave her none. I played the role of the supportive partner, even brushing a stray hair from her shoulder before we left. She thought it was tenderness. In reality, it was permission. Permission for her to walk straight into the trap. The hall was filled with her family. Cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents. Mara's father stood near the front, shaking hands, his pride in hosting clear. When he spotted us, he gave a nod but not a smile. His coldness wasn't lost on her. She gripped my arm tighter as we walked in, needing the appearance of unity. Conversations carried on, glasses filled and emptied, and I watched her settle into small talk with relatives who barely looked her in the eye. The whispers had already traveled, carried by the packages I had mailed. Tonight wasn't about planting seeds, it was about detonation. Dinner was served, and speeches began. One cousin spoke about love, another about family, all words about stability and trust. The irony was thick. I felt Mara shift uncomfortably beside me, though she tried to mask it with a smile. When the projector flickered to life for a slideshow of the engaged couple, I slipped away from the table. No one noticed me head toward the booth in the back where the technician managed the visuals. The USB drive slid into his hand with the ease of a practiced move, and I whispered the change of order. A family slideshow could wait. I had a different story to tell. The lights dimmed, and the screen came alive. At first, it looked like another set of happy images. Mara with family at past holidays, Mara at a graduation. People smiled, relaxed. Then the frame changed. The timestamp glowed, 3:42 a.m. The angle was familiar, the front porch unmistakable. And there she was, Mara, kissing Ezra, leaning into him as though the world revolved around them. The room froze. Mara gasped, her hand darting to mine, but I didn't offer it. Her face drained of color, her breath shallow. The whisper followed, clear as a knife cutting through silence. Delete that. Gasps rippled across the tables. Her father's hand tightened on his glass until it snapped. The footage replayed once more before cutting to stills. Screenshots of emails, receipts from hotels, lines highlighted with her name and Ezra's tied together. One after another, like bullets fired into the room. Then, for the final strike, Ezra's text to Lydia appeared, mocking Mara, lying to both women, begging for money he didn't have. Chaos broke instantly. Her cousins shouted. Her mother covered her mouth. Her father demanded an explanation in a voice that rattled the chandeliers. Mara tried to stand, tried to speak, but the crowd turned on her faster than she could think. Words like shame, disgrace, liar tore through the air. Ezra had arrived late, slipping into the back earlier, and now he was trapped. Lydia, the girlfriend from abroad, had chosen this exact night to return. She walked straight up to him, holding printed copies of the evidence I had given her, and slammed them against his chest. His face crumpled, arrogance shattered. Two women screaming at him from opposite sides, family glaring, whispers spreading like wildfire. He tried to defend himself, but the walls closed in. I didn't linger. I stood quietly, letting the storm devour itself. Mara's father pointed at her, shouting that she was no longer welcome in his house. Her mother cried into her hands. Ezra shoved through the crowd, chased by Lydia's voice promising that everything he owed would be collected. Mara turned to me then, desperate, eyes wet, lips trembling. She reached out, but I stepped back, refusing even the gesture of pity. The crowd saw it. They saw me pull away, leaving her suspended in her shame with no ally. That sight was worth every sleepless night. I walked toward the exit as the shouting continued behind me. The cool air outside felt cleaner than the heavy atmosphere I left behind. By the time Mara stumbled out after me, the party was already in ruin. She screamed my name, but the only answer she got was the sight of her belongings already packed into black bags in the trunk of my car. When we arrived home, I didn't let her inside. I carried each bag to the curb and dropped them there, one by one, under the glow of the streetlight. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as she begged, as she wept, as she cursed me. The cameras caught it all. Her mascara streaked down her face, her voice broke, her pride evaporated. And when the last bag hit the ground, I closed the door behind me and locked it. She stayed there for an hour, screaming, until exhaustion wore her down again. The footage of that night joined the rest of my collection. Not for proof, not for leverage anymore, but for history, for the reminder of how easily the mask of control can slip away. The next morning, her messages came in floods again. She blamed Ezra. She blamed me. She begged for forgiveness. She demanded explanations. I answered none of them. Her family had already cut ties. Her lover had already turned into an enemy. Her reputation had already burned in front of dozens of witnesses. And this was only the beginning of her consequences. Ezra's downfall was catching speed too. Word spread at his workplace, not only about his affair, but about the debts closing in. Lydia had spoken to his boss, showing him the receipts that linked company funds to personal expenses. Within a week, he was suspended. His calls to Mara turned bitter, venomous, accusing her of ruining his life. But she had no safety net anymore. The irony was sharp. Two people who had tried to use me, now eating each other alive. For me, the satisfaction wasn't just in watching them fall. It was in how deliberate every step had been. I hadn't raised a hand, hadn't screamed, hadn't begged. I had simply turned their own actions into mirrors, forcing them to choke on the reflection. And yet, it wasn't enough. Public humiliation was a wound, but wounds heal. If I wanted the lesson to last, if I wanted the whisper delete that to echo in her head forever, then I needed to make sure her future was marked by the fallout. That would be part 2 of my revenge. Not the exposure, but the long-lasting shadow. For now, though, I watched from my window as the trash bags were picked up by her trembling hands, dragged to the back of a borrowed car. Neighbors stood silently, some shaking their heads, others simply staring. Mara avoided their eyes, but their judgment followed her anyway. She had been the woman who smiled too brightly at block parties, who bragged about trips funded by me. Now she was the woman caught at 3:42 a.m., begging in the street. And I was the man who hadn't deleted a thing. The engagement party was the explosion. What followed was the fallout, the slow, grinding collapse that turned Mara and Ezra's lives into rubble. I didn't need to lift a hand anymore. Gravity was already pulling them down. My part was only to tilt the ground a little steeper, to make sure they slid all the way. For Mara, the family's rejection hit hardest. She had always leaned on them for status, using their approval as proof that her choices carried weight. But the footage on the projector had burned through her carefully cultivated image. Her father refused her calls outright. Her mother blocked her number after one final text that read like an obituary. "You've humiliated us. Don't come back." Mara's younger cousins spread the video like wildfire. Screenshots hit group chats. Whispers turned to open laughter. Her name became a punchline at gatherings. She wasn't Mara anymore. She was, delete that, the woman who begged a camera lens to erase her betrayal. Even the neighbors who had seen her scream outside my house didn't bother with subtlety. I caught one of them filming her from across the street when she tried to collect the last of her belongings. She noticed, froze, then retreated to her car, her pride shredded in silence. The financial strain crushed her next. With our accounts severed and her family withdrawing support, she was left exposed. She tried leaning on Ezra, but his situation was even worse. He was drowning in debts. His girlfriend Lydia had cut him off permanently, and his suspension at work stretched into termination when his boss uncovered the fraud. By the time he realized his world was collapsing, it was too late. I had made sure of that. An anonymous tip to a client here, a nudge toward a creditor there. Nothing overt, nothing traceable, just enough to let his own recklessness finish the job. Mara clung to him anyway, too afraid to stand alone. Their relationship mutated into something ugly. Two people bound not by love, but by shared ruin. Their texts, which I still intercepted through her forgotten tablet account, went from desperate affection to bitter accusations. He blamed her for distracting him. She blamed him for dragging her further down. The irony was delicious. The same porch where they once kissed had now become a tombstone for everything they tried to build. Meanwhile, I flourished. Work became easier without the weight of her games. My house felt lighter without her staged laughter, and my nights were quiet again. I didn't chase new relationships, didn't run to fill the void. There was no void. I had burned it away. Instead, I focused on watching the slow decay of the people who thought they could humiliate me. Weeks passed, and Mara's descent accelerated. She tried applying for better jobs, but whispers followed her. Small-town reputations spread fast, and even in the city her name was stained. Employers Googled her, saw the rumors, and quietly moved her application to the shredder. She settled for a cashier position at a discount store, clocking long hours for meager pay. The woman who once mocked me for being too careful with money now counted coins behind a plastic counter. Ezra fared even worse. The creditors I'd tipped off didn't stop at threats. Court dates appeared, repossession notices stacked at his door. The car he once flaunted disappeared overnight when the tow truck arrived. He moved into a dingy one-room apartment, and even that slipped through his fingers when the rent went unpaid. Mara followed him there briefly, clinging to the scraps of what they once called love. But even misery has limits. The fights grew violent, not in fists but in words sharpened to blades. She accused him of ruining her life. He accused her of destroying his career. Neither was wrong, and both were right. Eventually, she left, dragging her suitcase down the cracked pavement while neighbors muttered under their breath. The last time I saw her in person was months later, though not directly. She didn't see me. I spotted her at the bus stop near downtown, uniform creased, hair unkempt, eyes hollow. She looked like a ghost of the woman who once demanded everything from me, who once strutted through parties on my arm as if she owned the night. Now she stood with her head down, clutching a bag of groceries she probably counted pennies for. I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. Her punishment wasn't in seeing me again. It was in knowing the world she built on lies had collapsed and that she couldn't pin the blame on anyone but herself. Ezra vanished almost entirely. Rumors said he left the state. Others said he was living in his brother's garage. A friend of a friend told me he had been arrested once for unpaid debts, though I never verified it. I didn't care enough. His fall was complete, whether in prison or poverty. Either way, the smirk he gave me that night on my porch had been erased forever. People asked me sometimes, colleagues, distant friends, how I managed after such a betrayal. They expected stories of heartbreak, of sleepless nights, of therapy and recovery. I gave them polite answers, smiled when appropriate, but never told them the truth. The truth was simpler. I hadn't just survived it. I had taken control of it. I had turned their betrayal into a slow execution, and I had enjoyed every moment. Not in the way of sadistic glee, but in the satisfaction of balance. They thought betrayal would be a private wound, something I would carry alone while they carried on freely. Instead, it became their public shame, their endless burden, while I walked away untouched. The night at 3:42 a.m. became the pivot of everything. The camera's ping, the footage, the whisper of "delete that." It had been the spark that lit the fuse. She wanted me to erase it, to erase her mistake. Instead, I let it play on repeat until it consumed her entire life. There's a particular cruelty in silence, I've learned. Not shouting, not begging, not arguing, just silence. It forces people to fill the space with their own guilt, their own collapse. Mara had begged, cursed, pleaded, but my refusal to respond was louder than any words. She broke herself against it, and Ezra followed. In the end, I never touched them. I never raised my hand, never confronted them in the way people expect. I didn't need to. They destroyed themselves with the evidence I let loose, with the debts I nudged into motion, with the shame I refused to erase. Sometimes I rewatch the footage, not out of longing, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of how fragile masks are, how quickly arrogance can turn to begging. The sight of her whispering, "delete that," feels like poetry now. The very thing she feared most, exposure, became the one thing I refused to grant her. She wanted erasure. Instead, she got permanence. Months later, when the dust fully settled, I walked past that same porch camera. It blinked, as always, watching silently, recording the empty street. I smiled at the lens, not out of habit, but out of acknowledgement. That camera had been the witness, the spark, the tool. And in the end, it was the difference between me and them. Life moved forward. New people entered it. New routines formed. But the scar of that night remained, not on me, but on them. For Mara, it meant a lifetime of whispers. For Ezra, it meant debts he could never outrun. For me, it meant clarity, the certainty that no one could ever hold power over me the way they once thought they could. Revenge doesn't erase betrayal. It doesn't heal the wound, but it ensures the betrayer bleeds longer than you ever did. At 3:42 a.m., my doorbell camera pinged, and everything that followed was the price they paid for asking me to delete it.